Ignatius Loyola set out as a solitary pilgrim when he began his journey. And then the Lord shows him that he cannot do this alone. And so in Paris, he gathers companions, and together, these companions decide to live a certain way of life, that they want to help souls for the greater glory of God. And when they finish their studies in Paris, these companions, there are 9 of them by this time, decide to set off for Venice because they want to do a pilgrimage together to the Holy Land. They want to go to those places where Jesus walked. They knew, however, this may be difficult because of Ignatius's previous experience. So they go to Venice and they decide they're going to give themselves 1 year in Venice to see if they can get a ship or not to the Holy Land. And if they cannot, in a year's time, they will decide what they are going to do, what their future holds. The companions get to Venice, and in Venice they begin to minister to the people of the area. And we are told that they teach the basics of the faith to children. Ignatius gives the spiritual exercises, which he most enjoys doing. He also enters into spiritual conversation. Some of the companions are teaching in schools and universities, and other companions are looking after the outcasts and the poor and the sick. And it's recorded that in Venice, many people were drawn to devotion of Christ because of the work of these companions. There's a story told too of one of the companions who leaves to another region, Bassano La Grappa, and while he is there, he falls sick. Ignatius gets a message that Alphonsus Rodriguez is very ill and may even not live. And immediately Ignatius sets out with another companion, Peter Favre, who Ignatius considered one of the best givers of the spiritual exercises, to go and visit Rodriguez. On the way, Ignatius says to Favre that he has the assurance from God that Rodriguez will not die from his illness. When they get to Rodriguez, they find him very ill, but he is so comforted, he says, by the visit of Ignatius and feels so cared for that immediately his spirits are lifted. And so Ignatius and Favre spend a number of days with Rodriguez as he gets better, and then together these men return to Venice to continue their ministry. Ignatius not only cared for those he ministered to, but he cared very much for his companions who were with him together on this mission to help souls. They go back to Venice, and after 1 year, they decide they need to come together and discuss their future. In Venice as well, some of these companions are ordained to the priesthood, Ignatius being amongst them. And so they meet and they decide that the best way forward is for them to go to Rome to put themselves at the disposal of the Pope. It's very interesting. This is the second time that they are not able to stay or reach the Holy Land. Ignatius wants to stay in the Holy Land. He's not able to do that. These companions want to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and they are not able to do that. And it's an important lesson for the companions. Why? Because they realize that the will of God and discernment also has to take into account the reality of the context that they are in. And the reality of their context is that they cannot go to the Holy Land. So the companions hit the road for Rome. Ignatius describes that he is very anxious, he's very worried and fearful of what the future may hold. And he says he has to remember back to that Cardinal experience where he knew with certainty that the Lord was leading him, although he did not know where the Lord will take him. And he says when he remembers that experience, it brings a certain peace to his spirit, an assurance that God is in control. On their way to Rome, about 20 kilometers outside of Rome, they stop at a little chapel called La Storta. Now, Ignatius the pilgrim normally does this. Wherever he travels, he stops at small chapels and churches to pray as he walks along. But something very significant happens in this chapel at La Storta. First of all, Ignatius is given the assurance in prayer that the Lord will be gracious to him and his companions in Rome. And this gives Ignatius great peace and consolation. And it is significant because this is part of their discernment as a group, that the Lord now says to Ignatius, I will be gracious to you and your friends in the city of Rome. And so his anxiety and his fear subside. But something else happens. Ignatius has been praying right from Manresa that he would be placed with the Son. And in this chapel, Ignatius sees the Son, Jesus, carrying the cross. And he says, the eternal Father looks upon him and Jesus and says to Jesus, I want you to take this man as your servant. And from that moment, Ignatius's relationship with Jesus takes on a different dynamic. Ignatius wanted to encounter Jesus, and he wanted to be a co-worker with Jesus for the kingdom. But now notice the difference. Ignatius is not simply wanting to be a co-worker, but he wants to be with Jesus. He wants to experience what Jesus experiences. And so there is a new sense of relationship, a relationship of unity with Jesus. And it is very significant that it is the Jesus, the poor Christ, who is carrying the cross that Ignatius seeks to be one with. It is not in his public ministry, but rather with the Jesus who carries the cross. Ignatius wants to be with Jesus in such a way that he sees the world through the eyes of Jesus, that he feels the world through the heart of Jesus. And so this deep union takes place, and a new level of relationship comes about between Ignatius and Jesus. There's something else that happens there as well. Ignatius has recently been ordained a priest, and these companions, although they are companions of Jesus, they also are priests. And he comes to see through this experience that a priest, like we read in the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 5, verse 7, a priest is someone who surrenders himself for others. The letter to the Hebrews tells us how Jesus lets go of his sonship. And so Ignatius realizes that his priesthood is for humanity, and by living his priesthood, and those of his companions as well, living their priesthood, they are called to surrender themselves for humanity. And Jesus surrendered himself for humanity. And finally, after this experience, Ignatius is absolutely convinced that they are to be called the companions of Jesus. They call themselves friends in the Lord. They call themselves companions. But in this prayer experience, Ignatius is set now on the group being identified with Jesus, the companions of Jesus who will labor with Jesus under the banner of the cross, that they want to follow the poor Christ to Calvary under the banner of the cross. Feeling confident, feeling assured, feeling consoled, Ignatius and his companions now head for the city of Rome. They arrive in Rome and they go to speak to the Pope, Pope Paul III, and immediately he gives them work. Some of the companions are sent to work in universities and schools. Others, like Ignatius, give the spiritual exercises and enter into spiritual conversation with the people of Rome. But importantly, some of the companions are willing to work with the outcasts in the city of Rome, especially those who struggled with addictions of various types and prostitutes. And these priests become known as poor pilgrim priests. They are different to the other priests that people meet in Rome. At this time, there are many struggles within the church. People are seeking ecclesiastical offices. There is a lot of corruption in ministry. For many people, the poor and the outcasts are not important and are even neglected by the clergy. Yet Ignatius and his companions choose to insert themselves amongst the poor and the outcasts. And people in Rome begin to speak about the appearance of these companions. They begin to speak about the way that they preach. They begin to speak about the way that they reach out to others and their simple lifestyle. Because Ignatius insists that even though they are ministering in Rome, they should still beg for their sustenance, very different to many of the other clergy who were living, so to speak, on the fat of the land. And so these pilgrim priests minister in a way which is different, that somehow their experience of the poor Christ gives them a new model of ministry. But they also experience some difficulty and, for Ignatius, immense suffering in Rome. He begins to see what it means to be placed with Christ under the banner of the cross. One of the companions has someone that they work with, a helper. And this helper decides to start spreading various rumors about the orthodoxy of these companions. And so the rumors begin, and soon people stop coming to the companions to be taught the basics of the faith. They no longer show up to listen to their sermons. And even the dean of the cardinals at the time persecutes these companions. There is a kind of jealousy because they have become so popular amongst the other clergy of Rome. And given what was happening at the time in the church and the Reformation, it was easy to point fingers and to say, these are unorthodox people. You may not listen to them. And so their ministry diminishes. And Ignatius becomes terribly anxious about this and suffers as their reputation is destroyed in the city of Rome. Eventually, Ignatius decides to go to Pope Paul III and insist that an investigation should take place. Now, Paul III didn't really see this as too much of a problem, but the stubborn streak of Ignatius persisted, and he said to Paul III, I insist that you call an investigation, that you have a trial, that you investigate what we are saying and teaching, so that we can be cleared. And indeed, Pope Paul III does exactly that. The companions are put on trial, and eventually they are cleared of the accusations. But it is very difficult for them to regain the reputation that they had from when they first arrived in Rome. And so Ignatius describes his deep suffering. Ignatius sees that being placed with the Christ on the road to Calvary has consequences, and sometimes those consequences are really difficult. In his book, Brian Grogan, Alone and on Foot, talking about this part of Ignatius's life, says, well, there were other afflictions they also suffered. And he speaks about the terrible swarms of mosquitoes in Rome. And he says, Ignatius said that these mosquitoes not only disturbed their daily meditation, but these mosquitoes too gave them a penance that they had not hoped for. Eventually, the companions decide to go to Pope Paul III and to put themselves generously at the service of the universal church, to be willing to minister anywhere in the world, in any language, amongst any people that needed to be ministered to. And this is significant because for Ignatius, being with Christ means to have the freedom that Christ has, to surrender completely so that they can be sent wherever it is that the Father wants them to be sent, despite whatever suffering that may bring to them. And so Pope Paul III gives these companions various missions at the time, and later will recognize them as a religious congregation. It's very significant, this part of Ignatius's life. In Manresa, at the Cardinale, Ignatius sees Christ giving himself for him. Now, at La Storta, Ignatius sees Christ giving himself to him. In other words, that now Christ allows Ignatius to see the world through his eyes, to feel the world through his heart. He allows him to participate in the very way that Christ himself lived. There is a union that takes place, that for Ignatius now he is able to see in a different way. His encounter with Christ led him to want to follow Christ. Now at La Storta, what happens is Ignatius sees how, seeing through the eyes of Christ, he can be the compassion and the love of Christ in a new way. In other words, Ignatius feels that now the heart of Christ lives within him. And somehow this changes his perspective once again and develops more deeply his relationship with Jesus Christ. And so these three significant spiritual moments in Ignatius's life, in his convalescence at Loyola, at the Cardinale in Manresa, and La Storta just outside Rome, will be the key spiritual experiences that shape his whole life and draw him deeper and deeper into a friendship with Jesus Christ. And this is what makes his ministry and the ministry of his companions different to those of the other clergy at the time. That they realize how being with Christ, feeling, seeing with Christ, enables them to feel compassion and love with all those that they minister to, because they are ministering the love and the compassion of Christ that flows through them. And so Ignatius and his companions in Rome have now moved to a different kind of relationship with Christ, one in which they seek union, one in which they are able to see the world through the very heart and mind of Christ himself.
Someone once said to me, Trevor, we never learn from experience, we only learn when we reflect upon it. And I think similarly, as we reflect upon our experience, we get some clues as to how God has been present in our own past history. And that gives us some sense of how to recognize God's clues as we move forward.
When we look back, when we are engaged in that sort of reflection, we start to see how different strands of our lives come together. We start to detect how Christ is working, how God is working in our lives. And very often, when God is at work, we don't always notice it at the time, but looking back, somehow we're able to bring these threads together. And when these threads come together, it gives us a sense of direction. It gives us a sense of where Christ is inviting us and leading us.